really good reason to think that. In this movie, Dracula Untold actually gets that right. So again, this is why I'm so impressed with this movie. Count Dracula is never referred to in Bram Stoker's Dracula as Vlad. His impaling practices are also never brought up, except for how vampires are impaled, but that doesn't come from Vlad Dracul or Vlad Tepes. That comes from folklore of Eastern European folklore. There's not much evidence that Stoker knew much about the Wallachian prince, just like bare bones information. The better idea is that Bram Stoker used the biblical imagery of the devil for his ideas of Dracula, where the biblical story in Revelations of the dragon is associated with the devil, and that Dracula, the vampire, is sort of a perversion of Christian doctrine where he drinks blood, which is a perversion of the Eucharist. And but in Eastern Europe, the dragon didn't have a devilish symbol at all. It was an idea showing strength in battle and this military order and this knightly order. So the meaning in Romania would be very different. And I've heard that Romanians don't really like that Vlad Dracul has been the inspiration for Count Dracula. Anyway, so that's my overview of historical stuff. Anything you'd like to throw in, Steve, before I just get into our belovedly silly movie?
I mean, I guess for Romanians, it would be the same thing as if you told an American that George Washington was a vampire or like a werewolf or something, It would, they probably, most people are Sam Houston was actually a blood-sucking vampire. People might have a problem with that. So you can see the Romanians might have a legitimate gripe there.
I can see that. No one likes that. And I read the reason that apparently some Turks didn't like this movie, contemporary Turkish people, because it casts Mehmet the Conqueror in a bad light. And he's a national hero to them. But let me just mention the plot. So...
I mean, this movie, I have no offense.
It's very silly. I do not deny how silly it is. And that's why I like it.
I think you can't get too offended by this movie. I mean,
I know. I mean, you're very oversensitive if you do. So listeners, if you don't like schlock, I don't think you'll like this. If you can tolerate it, then there you go. So basically, it begins in 1442 with a voiceover narration, kind of like the movie 300, that discusses Ottoman enslavement of 1,000 Transylvanian boys. It says, they were trained to kill without conscience and beaten without mercy. No, I mean, whatever. Yeah, I mean, the training was tough, don't get me wrong, but it's not like they were... it's trying to make it like 300 in the Spartans, whatever.
Yeah, it was really a very 300-ish... the whole movie.
Yeah, especially in the cinematography, where at one point Vlad is climbing a cliff the way that Leonidas did. So there's some silly... That's part of the silliness. And then it mentions Vlad the Impaler, son of the dragon. We flash forward. It mentions that he had been taken into the Sultan's service, which he was, and he was held as royal ransom. Then it flashes forward to contemporary days around the 1460s, where Vlad III is an adult. I can't talk about the Wallachian costumes. They look a little bit too padded, like medieval garb. I wrote down they look like the medieval section at Nordstrom's. At one point, when it begins, there's a group of what they call themselves Transylvanians, so I'll call them that. They're tracking Ottoman scouts, and they're dressed like jebejis, which are light infantry that have a metal hat that looks like a Hershey's Kiss. That's accurate costuming. Other Janissaries, the typical costume looks like they're wearing like a giant square folded cloth hat, and that would have been the light infantry. But yeah, heavy infantry would have been decked out in that way. Then the soldiers, they end up going to a mountain cave and get eaten by a vampire. I'm not going to waste too much time in this movie talking about the supernatural shenanigans, but that's the first point. Basically, what can I say? Vlad's wife is dressed, I wrote, like a buxom wench. I doubt a princess would have been dressed like that. In their room, they have enough candlelight for an Orthodox cathedral, and he talks about being sent to live with the Turks as a boy for 10 years, which he had. They feast and call each other Transylvanians, and then one character, Hamza Bey, a military leader, he storms in on their feasting, which would have been an Easter feast. At this point in the movie, this is what shocks me. he asks, where are my scouts? They're missing. Vlad says, I have no idea. Hamza wants to suggest that you've hidden them, and he speaks to Vlad in Turkish, and it's accurately Turkish. When I was listening, I thought, and what they're saying is, I know they're being held in a dark dungeon or still there, kind of like saying, I know what you did. And Vlad would have known Turkish. He lived in the Ottoman Empire for 10 years. His accent was kind of weird, and I had to go on IMDb to say, was that actor Turkish? And he wasn't. So he probably just had to learn from a set consultant and speak it sort of phonetically. But yeah, it was accurate Turkish. So there you go. They didn't have to do that, but they did. Then Hamza, he kind of proclaims to the assembly of Transylvanian nobles that they require 1,000 boys for the Janissary Corps, that recruits aged 10 to 14 will go fight in Hungary, and those younger than 10 are going to prepare for a siege to Vienna. Now, like I said, they recruited in villages. They did not recruit elite. They wouldn't have also announced their future plans for conquest to people. But those were Ottoman plans, so that's, kind of half right.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, that's a big plus.
Yeah. So then Vlad goes to an Ottoman camp, and there are Janissary soldiers that are accurately dressed in heavy assault troops, where they have the metal Hershey's Kiss hat, Zihirli Nefer, which means armored soldiers. So that's kind of what those represent. We meet Mehmet the Conqueror, Sultan Mehmet there. It's in the 1460s, and he would have been in about his 30s. He conquered Constantinople when he was only 21. So the actor portraying him is age appropriate. He demands hostages and 1,000 troops, and then he gives him a deed, and it's in Ottoman Turkish. And I didn't look at it close enough to see what it said, because there was only a corner visible, and it was probably just something that somebody grabbed online. It could have been a tax deed for all anyone knows, but they bothered to get the right language. So again, good for them. Ottoman Turkish is kind of obscure as a scholarly language. So Vlad is about to hand over his son. Part of the terms of their deals are royal ransom, but then he decides at the last second not to and kills a bunch of Ottoman diplomats, I suppose. So this is where the supernatural shenanigans begin. Vlad goes to the cave where the Turkish soldiers were killed, and there's an old vampire there and says, I'll give you powers, my special vampire powers. You have to not drink blood for 3 days. If you don't, you'll return to your human state. If you do drink blood, then you will be able to, or you'll release me and I'll unearth like kind of this army of undead. I didn't really follow that very closely because it's all very silly, listeners. Okay, so this is where supernatural shenanigans begin. Vlad basically has the powers of 3 or 4 X-Men. He can control bats like Batman. He has Wolverine healing powers. He has spider sense like Spider-Man. Storm. I forget if he can control the weather. He can fly. So the Turks besieged their capital, and they're firing cannon on the Transylvanian. Their cannons are shaped in animal forms, like the Siege of Gondor in Return of the King. The Turks did have cannons, but they did not cast them in animal heads. But they were known for their artillery and their siege weapons, so that is accurate again. Janissaries are released first into battle. They would have released some volleys of arrow and cannon fire first. In this battle, the Janissaries don't use firearms, which is also correct. They detested it. They thought that it was... They prefer their compound bows or their battle axes and swords and other things. So Vlad goes out and he matrixes them to death with his X-Men powers. Then the Wallachians, there's a much larger Ottoman army coming. They go to a monastery up into the mountains to escape, which Kozia Monastery, which was used by Romanians to escape in the past. Mehmet promises to lead 100,000 troops, which he was capable of raising. He had up to 200,000 troops at the Siege of Constantinople. The Ottomans march. They have green flags, which is also accurate for the Ottoman flags of the time, and they're standard. Vlad also leaves behind a bunch of impaled troops, so Mehmet has his troops march blindfolded. He never did such a thing. The troops also march in a perfect grid formation. troops did not march that way. That's a Prussian military thing. I don't know who did that. That's more of a Frederick the Great type of thing. It's definitely not an Ottoman deal. But you do see drummers there. So the famous Ottoman military band, the Meter Band, that is there. So that the percussion section that Ottoman armies would have, that was the inspiration for Turkish marches that Mozart and others would have a few centuries later. So again, something else that is correct that didn't need to be. So I'm just getting excited about this. Ottomans come to a mountain pass. It looks like orcs coming to the Battle of Helm's Deep in the Two Towers. So the set designer was very influenced by Lord of the Rings, obviously. Romanians fire flaming arrows. So
yes,
that's been a consistent theme. I think in almost every movie we've done, there's been flaming arrows.
That was one of the faults of the Alamo, was that there wasn't flaming arrows.
I mean, I forget, like, was there really any use for flaming arrows historically, if what I know? Because, I mean, if you're firing off dozens of arrows in battle, that's a lot of time to flame, and it's not going to really kill someone anymore. And it's not like you're going to be a sharpshooter who will say, oh, look, there's the munitions depot and the gunpowder. I'm going to blow it up by a careful crack shot. So, do you know anything, Steve, about flaming arrows? Because we see these all over the place. Did they actually serve any purpose in the past?
From what I understand, that the arrow, they had to have so much incendiary material on them. They didn't have very good range, and they weren't very accurate. So maybe they used them to some degree, maybe in the beginning of a siege or something, to put on a show, but I cannot imagine that they had whole quiverfuls of incendiary arrows. That just...
Yeah, I don't know if, like, maybe the Byzantines...
Yeah, I just can't buy it.
Like, I guess if the Byzantines, maybe if they had Greek fire and wanted to light up an enemy ship, they could do it that way, but it's not... I mean, if you watch movies, you will think that they will fire volley after volley of burning arrows, and then when they're running out, they'll fire normal arrows. But this movie, because it's total schlock, it of course has flaming arrows. And then when Vlad is fighting the main core of the Ottoman army, that's where his full X-Men powers are unleashed, and he spends basically 5 minutes unleashing bats on the Ottomans. So if you want to see total bat carnage, this is your movie.
So much bats, yeah.
His wife dies. He flies to try to save her. It looks as silly as how I'm describing it. He then creates a small mini army of Transylvanians by drinking their blood and turning them to other vampires. And then he puts on his dragon armor, and his vampire army fight the Ottomans. This isn't so much historical because we're obviously way out of history with this part, but more cinematic. And I was thinking, this movie is confused because you have a bloodsucker who's your protagonist. It's kind of hard to make a vampire your protagonist. So I appreciate at least what Twilight did with a nice little loophole where their protagonist vampires are vegans who don't drink the blood of humans, and that makes them good vampires versus bad vampires that do that. So it's a hard circle to square, anyway, to make your vampire the protagonist.
Yeah, that was one of the things we could talk more about. Is it's tough to decide who's the good guy in this movie.
Yeah, so that's where it gets confused. And then, so you want them to kill the Ottomans, but then he has blood-sucking vampires, so then Vlad has to stop them. Anyway, I'm sorry, listeners, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, Vlad confronts Mehmet. Mehmet, being very clever, he dumps silver coins all over the ground, knowing vampires' weakness for silver. Mehmet's I have to give him credit, he's very intimately familiar with vampire lore. And then he wants to stake Vlad to death. And most of the accoutrements of vampire lore don't really come into... They don't come around until about the 17th or 18th century. Before that, the idea of a vampire, you have legends of revenants, of creatures that come back from the dead that you can find in Greek and Roman myth and Chinese myth and other places, but a vampire, as we understand it, doesn't really come into being until the 17th, 18th century, but then it's Bram Stoker who finally puts all the pieces together and creates the vampire lore we know today. But Met knows it all, and he knows Vlad's weakness, so... and he even has a clever line when he's about to stake him, saying, "Fitting death for Lord Impaler." And then earlier in the movie, Vlad when he says his name is Dracul, he says that means son of the dragon, but then to Mehmet, he says that it's son of the devil, so he's sort of owning his evil vampireness. Well, Mehmet gets the better, or Vlad gets the better